Antarctica is the coldest, driest, and windiest of the Earth's continents. With average yearly temperature swings of over 160 degrees Fahrenheit, it is the harshest of locations on Earth. Yet it is also one of Earth's most fascinating places, with an abundance of life on land and in the seas, as well as scientific and resource opportunities. It is this fascination that has led a host of speculators and explorers to both contemplate and research the continent. As far back as 600 BC, Greek philosophers theorized northern and southern polar regions as they contemplated around Earth. And nearly 500 years later, famed geographer Claudius Ptolemy published Geographia, in which he speculatively wrote of Terra Australis Incognita, or unknown southern lands. The first map of an Earth with frigid poles dates to 1150 and is based on the 5th century written work of the Roman writer Macrobius. The first mention of the word Antarctica appeared in 1505, when Matthias Ringman called the imagined lands Aura Antarctica, or Antarctic lands, or Antarctic lands. For centuries, the speculated Antarctic lands were referred to as some variant of the word Australia, but by the early 19th century the word Australia was applied solely to the lands then known as New Holland, and the name stuck. In 1774, famed explorer, Captain James Cook, circumnavigated Antarctica, never actually viewing the continent. However, Cook dispelled, once and for all, the idea of a green and populated land surrounding the South Pole. It wasn't until 1819 that Captain William Smith thoroughly documented his discovery of the South Shetland Islands, the first sighting of lands farther than 60 degrees south, and considered to be Antarctica. Later that year, the Royal Navy sent Edward Bransfield, with Smith as his pilot, to further explore Smith's find. Bransfield claimed the South Shetland Islands for King George III, who died the day before, and on the next day, sighted Trinity Peninsula, the northernmost point of the Antarctic mainland. But unknown to Bransfield, 2 days earlier, Russian explorer Fabian Gottlieb von Bellingshausen logged coordinates and sightings of land thought to be part of East Antarctica. Thus, sightings of the continent itself are disputed. That same year, the shipwreck of the Spanish Navy flagship, San Telmo, may have deposited the first humans to land on Antarctica, based on wreckage found by Captain Smith. However, no crew of the San Telmo were known to have survived to document the landing. It is thought that Captain John Davis, an American sailor and seal hunter, may have been the first person to set foot on the continent on February 7, 1821, while hunting for seals. Davis logged both his location and his thoughts that this southern land to be a continent. Another American whaler and sealer, Mercator Cooper, documented his landing on the continent on January 27, 1853. But it wasn't until 1895 that the first undisputed landing on the continent took place, when an expedition from the whaling research vessel Antarctica set foot at Cape Adare. But from 1838 to 1843, 2 major exploring expeditions were launched. One by the United States government, and the other by the British Association for the Advancement of Science. The United States exploring expedition focused on the Pacific region, with cursory Antarctic voyages, while the British endeavour, today known as the Ross Expedition, was launched specifically as a scientific expedition of the Antarctic. The Ross Expedition would become the foundational expedition, from which all later expeditions would follow.
It is not easy to describe the joy and light-heartedness we all felt as we passed the entrance of the channel, bounding before a favorable breeze over the blue waves of the ocean, fairly embarked in the enterprise we had all so long desired.
Thus began the voyage of the exploration ships Erebus and Terror, under the command of James Clark Ross, on October 5, 1839, bound for a magnetic survey of the southern regions of the globe. Although many discoveries and adventures were probably anticipated, little could anyone know just how significant this voyage would be to the world, and the explorers to follow. James Clark Ross was reportedly born in Finsbury Square, London, April 15, 1800, to George Ross, listed unflatteringly as an unsuccessful businessman, and Christina Clark, of whom virtually nothing is known. However, other references report James as born in Scotland, but this may be due to confusion with his famed uncle, John Ross, of Scotland. Little is known of James Ross's childhood. Some describe him as one of 8 children, wealthy, able, and good-looking, and that he attended school at Chislehurst Academy, on Heathfield Lane, in Chislehurst, Kent, Greater London. The academy no longer exists and little record of any building remains. But what is known is that James had a famous uncle, Sir John Ross, a Scottish Royal Navy officer and North Polar explorer. Under Sir John, James Clark Ross entered the Royal Navy in April of 1812. During this early period, James served successfully under his uncle John on several ships during the Napoleonic Wars. Then, at age 18, James served with his uncle John aboard the Isabella, on John's unsuccessful, and frankly disgraceful, first Arctic expedition, to solve the question of a northwest sea passage to the Far East. John Ross led this first expedition and commanded the hired vessel Isabella, accompanied by the Alexander, under the command of Lieutenant William Edward Parry. Commander John Ross was instructed to sail around Greenland and head north through the Davis Strait into Baffin Bay, in an attempt to find a passage west to the Bering Strait and onto the Pacific, reducing the trip to the Far East by thousands of miles. Ross and Parry sailed north into Baffin Bay, and proceeded west into Lancaster Sound. However, Ross reported that he saw a string of mountains across the entire width of the sound, as well as pack ice, blocking their way west. Ross named the mountains the Croker Mountains, and then reversed course and returned to England. Their arrival home drew considerable controversy, and the expedition's other officers, in particular Lieutenant William Parry, felt the expedition had failed to adequately explore the observed mountains. Commander John Ross lost favor with the Admiralty, and was criticized by the public, and, at the time, ruining his reputation. But John Ross's failure prompted the Admiralty to sponsor William Edward Parry's Northwest Expedition of 1819. On this voyage the young James Clark Ross, sailing as a midshipman, would begin to cement his reputation as a polar explorer. Parry, sailing during a fortuitously warm summer with relatively low sea ice, traveled further west, making observations and mapping features than anyone would again for another 30 years. Parry completed 3 more Arctic voyages, and in 1827, on his last expedition, traveled further north than anyone would for the next 49 years. James Ross accompanied Parry on 3 voyages, gaining knowledge and experience, and taking particular interest in magnetism and natural history. Parry wrote often of James Ross's contributions to the expeditions in his published journals, and even named a point of land after him during the 1819 voyage. In 1827, James Ross was promoted to the rank of commander, only 1 rank junior to a ship's captain. Parry's success prompted James's uncle, John Ross, to once again attempt an Arctic expedition. The British Admiralty would not sponsor the expedition. But John Ross was able to convince gin magnate Felix Booth to sponsor it privately. In 1829, James Ross once again joined his uncle John on the new Arctic expedition, aboard the side-wheel steamer Victory. John Ross proposed that a steam-powered ship could break through the ice. While the concept of an engine-powered icebreaker was innovative, the Victory was not up to the task. The Victory's steam engine was plagued with problems, and was dumped on shore October 20, 1829. John Ross wrote, "The last of the engine was hoisted out. May I not say that there was not one of us who did not hail this event with pleasure? The Victory and its crew were then trapped in ice for the next 2 winters of 1829 and 1830, moving only 3 miles during the summer of 1830, under the labors of its crew cutting ice, and hauling Victory through the cuts." During the Victory's winter layovers, James Ross made a number of land expeditions. On June 1, 1831, James crossed the Boothia Peninsula to Cape Adelaide, and became the first person to reach the elusive North Magnetic Pole, where he planted the British flag. James Ross wrote,
"I believe I must leave it to others to imagine the elation of mind with which we found ourselves now at length arrived at this great object of our ambition. But nature here had erected no monument to denote the spot which she had chosen as the center of one of her great and dark powers. We fixed the British flag on the spot and took possession of the North Magnetic Pole and its adjoining territory in the name of Great Britain and King William IV.
In the summer of 1831, the Victory again moved only a short distance, and once again spent the next winter trapped in ice. At this point, it was deemed that the Victory was helplessly trapped, and would not move again. On May 29, 1832, the crew departed Victory on foot. After 3 months of travel across land, and by sea, in repaired lifeboats, the crew was rescued by the whaler Isabella. By October 1833, they were back in England. The scientific information, along with new relationships established with the native Inuit population, brought John Ross the fame he had long sought, and cemented James Clark Ross as possibly the most experienced polar explorer of his time. Sometime in 1834, James Ross met and fell in love with a young Miss Anne Coleman, 17, daughter of Thomas Coleman, Whitgift Hall, Yorkshire. Thomas Coleman was not pleased with the affair, as Ross was a penniless adventurer. As an acknowledged polar explorer, Ross could be gone for years, and might likely never return from his adventures. As such, the two lovers maintained a level of secrecy from both her family and the Admiralty, as Ross continued his career. In October of 1834, Ross was promoted to captain. In December of 1835, James Ross once again departed for the Arctic waters. This time in search of 11 whaling vessels trapped in the ice of Baffin Bay. The Admiralty provided Ross with the HMS Cove, a 380-ton whaler, outfitted in Hull, England. Ross departed in January of 1836, but unknown to Ross and crew, all but 3 of the whalers had returned to England. Of the 3 remaining whalers, the Middleton was wrecked, with her crew rescued by the Lady Jane and the View Forth. Of those rescued, many were sick, and Ross personally rented a building in the port town of Stromness Harbour, Orkney Islands, and outfitted it as a hospital. Now, only the William Tor remained missing. By July 1836, Ross and the Cove had sailed as far as 70 degrees north, off the west coast of Greenland, with no sign of the missing William Tor. With nothing more to learn of the William Tor, Ross returned to England in August 1836. Over time, small items of the William Tor were found at sea, and it was concluded the whaler and its crew were crushed in the ice and lost. From 1835 to 1839, while not leading the Cove expedition, Ross was a key participant in the British Magnetic Survey, joining Edward Sabine, John Phillips, and Humphrey Lloyd on the survey. This was the first mapping of the magnetic fields throughout Great Britain. While this first survey was not the grandest of expeditions, it was an important step in the advancement of instrumentation and scientific field work. whereas it has been represented to us that the science of magnetism may be essentially improved by an extensive series of observations made in high southern latitudes, we have caused Her Majesty's ships, Erebus and Terror, to be prepared for a voyage, and from the experience we have had of your abilities, zeal, and good conduct, we have thought fit to entrust you with the command of the expedition. The 14th day of September, 1839. To James Clark Ross, Esquire, Captain of HMS Erebus. Thus was ordered by the British Admiralty the beginning of one of the greatest expeditions in history, and the voyage that would cement James Clark Ross into the annals of seafaring explorers. But unknown at the time, the ships Erebus and Terror, along with the Terror's new captain, Francis Crozier, would later be recorded in history for a far less fortuitous adventure. Ross actually received command of the Erebus the previous April 9, 1839, with command of the Terror awarded to Francis Crozier, under Ross's command, a month later. Ross records that the Erebus was a Hecla-class bomb ship of 370 tons, and was of strong build and capacious hold. The Terror was a Vesuvius-class bomb ship of 340 tons. Bomb ships were stoutly built vessels, and of the 8 built, all were eventually converted to exploration or service ships. From August 15 to September 30 of 1839, the 2 ships sailed out of their London docks, and finally cleared the Thames River, east of London, and headed into the English Channel, where they were immediately struck by a gale storm, and Erebus was separated from Terror. The separation of ships in the days of sailing was not unusual, and Ross continued on, leaving sight of England on October 5. By October 20, the Erebus anchored at the island of Madeira, where she was joined by Terror on the 24th. From Madeira, the ships sailed on to the Cape de Verde Islands, off the coast of modern Senegal, Africa, arriving November 13, then on to St. Paul's Rocks, a desolate set of rocks, racked by the sea. On landing, one of the sailors was swept away by large waves, and almost lost, but being a strong swimmer, he was able to make it back to the rocky shore. Erebus and Terror crossed the equator midnight December 3, 1839, and viewed the Southern Cross constellation a few days later. On December 17, the ships arrived at the island of Trinidad, now the modern archipelago of Trinidad and Martin Vaz. Ross described that the magnetic observations were utterly valueless, and the crew added a cock and 2 hens to the island's existing stock of wild pigs and goats. The ships left by that evening. The ships began experiencing regular sharp squalls each day upon crossing the southern equinox of the Tropic of Capricorn. Each squall required the crew to lower all the sails but one, and to deal with rough seas. During this time they attempted to determine the depth of the open ocean. Their current sounding lines could not find the bottom, so they fashioned a line of over 21,000 feet in length with a 76-pound weight. They finally found bottom at over 14,000 feet, or more than 2.5 miles deep. Ross himself made advances in the science of ocean sounding, but, by modern standards, Ross's sounding equipment was still inadequate to the task of deep ocean soundings, and a number of his measurements later proved to be inaccurate. Although not recorded in Ross's book, the ships welcomed in the new year at sea. They then arrived and spent 10 days at the island of St. Helena Rhodes, now the modern St. Helena, departing January 9, 1840. For the next 2 months, the ships remained at sea, recording their scientific observations, arriving in Simon's Bay, now the modern Simon's Town, South Africa, March 17. Heading south from South Africa, the Erebus was separated from the Terror, but continued on, taking measurements and observations along the way. On April 14, Ross describes a violent storm that struck Erebus.
The rain came down, literally in sheets of water, accompanied by very violent squalls from various quarters, alternately with perfect, but almost momentary calms.
Ross described the rain as the heaviest rain I ever witnessed. The winds were so strong that Ross thought they might lose a mast as the waves broke over the ship. Based on Ross's recording of Erebus's latitude and longitude, it is likely that Erebus had arrived at the famed Roaring Forties, a band of strong winds and high seas, found between 40 and 50 degrees south latitude. Temperatures were also dropping rapidly, and Ross ordered his men to take precautions to dress warm. They then spotted their first occurrence of penguins. By April 21st, Erebus spotted the Prince Edward's Islands and tried to anchor and land, but the conditions did not permit it, and they sailed on for Crozitt's Islands. Terror was a day behind. April 24th was a fine day, as Ross wrote, but the Crozitts were not to be found at the location marked on his charts. Ross did find the islands at an updated location, provided to him by a merchant back in Cape Town, South Africa. From April 26th to about May 2nd, Erebus fought the wind and waves to beat a path to an anchor location at the Crozitts' Possession Island. Although never able to anchor, Erebus did meet the boats of some seal hunters living at America Bay, on Possession Island. Ross described that the sealers
looked more like Esquimaux than civilized beings, but filthier far in their dress and persons than any I had ever before seen.
Ross gleaned little useful information from the sealers, but did drop off some supplies for them acquired in South Africa. On May 12th, after days of fighting hard against severe weather, Erebus finally made anchor at Christmas Harbour, in the Kerguelen Islands, now part of the French Southern and Antarctic lands, in the South Indian Ocean. Terror arrived the next day, and the expedition spent the next 9 weeks studying and charting the islands. The expedition botanist, Dr. Joseph Dalton Hooker, described the islands. The island presents the appearance of absolute sterility, and when the voyager draws nearer the land, the scenery scarcely improves. Ross also commented on the appearance of coal seams in the rocks, and speculated about the coming age of steam ships, and that the Kerguelen Islands might be desirable
to have a coal depot at this island, in order to reach all our Indian and Australasian colonies.
After weeks of observations, the ships left the Kerguelens on July 20, 1840. Shortly after, Ross wrote of the strong easterly current that flowed in this part of the ocean, likely documenting what is today known as the Antarctic Circumpolar Current. On the 29th, Erebus, and probably Terror, although the two ships were out of view, rode out a hurricane in which the seas broke over the rails and flooded the decks to a depth of 2 feet. The winds were so strong that Ross described that the waves were actually subdued by the winds, even as
the waves were driven completely over us in sheets of water.
But it was after the storm that tragedy struck Erebus. The boatswain, Mr. Roberts, fell overboard and drowned. In the rescue attempt, 2 boats were swamped and several more men swept to sea. Although Mr. Roberts could not be found, the other men were rescued. By now the ships were regularly seeing icebergs in the water, and lookouts were posted to try and spot the hazards. Gale winds struck regularly, and cold bad weather prevailed. On August 12, 1840, Ross reported that they spotted the coast of New Holland, now known as Australia, and then quickly were caught in another hurricane. Their close-reefed sails were quickly torn away. Erebus was unable to maneuver for many hours, until the storm began to subside. Storm-force winds continued for the next 3 days, and they were driven far south before again making headway. By 5 p.m. of August 17th, Erebus finally anchored in the River Derwent, Van Diemen's Land, near Hobart, now modern-day Tasmania, Australia. Terror had arrived the day before. They were warmly received by Lieutenant Governor Sir John and Lady Franklin. John Franklin would later command, and be lost, along with Terror Commander Francis Crozier, on the now famous Franklin's Lost expedition to the Arctic, commanding the very 2 ships Ross now sailed. The expedition remained in Van Diemen's Land for several months, awaiting the best time of year to sail the Antarctic region. During their stay, they repaired and provisioned their ships, conducted scientific surveys, and met with the commanders of 2 other expeditions anchored in Hobart. Ross did draw from the experiences of Captains Dumont d'Urville, leading a French expedition, and Charles Wilkes, leading the United States exploring expedition. Ross wrote that Captain d'Urville's voyage was public knowledge and published in the local papers. But the U.S. exploring expedition's accounts were kept secret by order of the U.S. government. However, Wilkes did correspond and provided Ross with significant information. But the records of both expeditions would turn out to be of little use. Ross decided to alter his original plans because, as Ross states, these two expeditions had pre-knowledge of his intended route and had explored there already. Ross commented of this conflict of national pride and interests, but continued that he had significant leeway in selecting his own Antarctic route.
I therefore resolved at once to avoid all interference with their discoveries, and selected a much more easterly meridian.
On November 12, 1840, the ship set sail from Van Diemen's Land. Ross wrote of the loss of crewman Edward Bradley to an accident, and of Mr. Molloy, who took ill, and was to be transported back to England. The two ships fought strong winds and currents on their way to the Auckland Islands, now part of modern New Zealand. Upon arrival, the crew spotted signs and notes left by both the French d'Urville and the American exploring expeditions. Little was learned from the notes. Ross wrote extensively of the science gathered, and the plant and animal life of the islands, as reported by Dr. Hooker, the botanist of the expedition. Dr. Hooker's work became the first published of the islands. The crew also left a number of animals and plants on the island, to seed the island with life more suitable for western voyagers, but are now considered invasive species. Ross also remarked of the economic advantages of the islands, and how it might make an excellent penal colony, even better than the Chatham Islands east of New Zealand. Regarding the Chatham Islands, Ross wrote,
"The want of good harbours will be found a great drawback, and the two tribes of New Zealanders, who took possession of it in 1835, after eating the half of the aborigines they found there, and making slaves of the other half, will prove a difficult people to dispossess of the land."
Ross named two small coves after Erebus and Terror, then weighed anchor on December 12, 1840, and headed for Campbell Island. Erebus and Terror arrived at Campbell Island the next day, and both ships immediately ran aground in the harbour. Erebus was quickly pulled off the bottom and anchored, but Terror had to wait for the next high tide before floating off the bottom. The ships were both undamaged. After completing the usual scientific observations and final preparations for the voyage south to Antarctica, the two ships departed on December 17th. As the expedition continued further south, they experienced more storms and strong currents. Christmas Day was spent in a strong gale. A few days later, at 63 degrees south latitude, they saw their first iceberg, and by the next day they were maneuvering between numerous large bergs and drift ice. On December 31st, Ross wrote that the weather was beautifully clear, and by that evening the line of the pack ice became visible. On New Year's Day the expedition crossed the Antarctic Circle, and arrived at the edge of the pack ice. As a New Year's gift, the crew received
an additional allowance of provisions, and a complete suit of warm clothing, provided by the liberality of the government.
Although the crew celebrated the new year, Ross wrote soberly of their situation.
"We had, indeed, met with the pack in a much lower latitude than we had expected.
On the 5th, after looking for openings in the pack ice for days, they finally pushed through the outer edge of the pack. The ships took very heavy blows from the ice before breaking into better water, and by noon the open ocean was no longer visible. As they pushed forward, Ross wrote that the ships
sustained violent shocks which nothing but ships so strengthened could have withstood.
The expedition pushed farther south through the ice, and by 5 a.m. January 9th broke through to open waters. The wind turned to a gale, and by noon the ships had run 30 miles farther south. As they passed 70 degrees south latitude, the expedition spotted land. Ross wrote of a mountain range at least 100 miles away that could be traced upon the horizon. Ross named the highest peak visible Mount Sabine, after a good friend and
zealous promoter of the expedition.
At noon of January 11, 1841, the expedition passed through 71 degrees 15 minutes south latitude and exceeded the
highest latitude attained by our great navigator in 1774.
Referring to the second voyage of Captain James Cook. The next day Ross, along with Crozier and a complement of men, left the ships and rowed toward shore. After fighting currents and ice, they made landfall on the newly named Possession Island and planted the British flag. Bad weather reduced their stay to only a short time before struggling back to the ships. The ships then fought severe weather for several days, before it cleared on the 15th. Ross then proceeded to name new mountains and landmarks never seen before. On the 17th, the expedition discovered an island, the southern tip of which he named Cape Ann, after his love back in England, and later his wife. For the next 10 days the ships plied the waters, dealing with storms, avoiding dangerous ice, and documenting everything they saw. Ross wrote of many of these observations, and speculated on what they might mean, introducing the reader to ideas and concepts that would, in later scientific discoveries, prove to be surprisingly accurate. On January 27, Ross, Crozier, and a party of crewmen rowed to the newly discovered and named Franklin Island. After a harrowing landing upon the icy rocks of the small island, Ross and others gathered specimens, then proceeded back to the ships.
All of us thoroughly drenched to the skin and painfully cold.
Ross wrote that at about midnight of the 27th, he logged the bearings of 8 separate islands, later to be determined as part of the mainland, but of which modern research does confirm some as islands. Of those islands, Ross and the expedition observed and named one of the most remarkable discoveries of any voyage.
It proved to be a mountain, 12,400 feet of elevation above the level of the sea, emitting flame and smoke in great profusion.
Ross named the active and erupting volcano Mount Erebus and a nearby extinct volcano of over 10,000 feet, Mount Terror. The expedition had discovered the highest active volcano in Antarctica, and remarkably, had measured the height at only 48 feet, different from modern observations. Later that day Ross wrote,
"As we approached the land, we perceived a low white line extending from its eastern extreme point as far as the eye could discern, and proving at length to be a perpendicular cliff of ice, between 150 and 200 feet above the level of the sea, perfectly flat and level at the top."
Without yet realizing it, the expedition had discovered the world's largest floating platform of ice, now commonly known as an ice shelf. Ross realized he could not sail beyond this insurmountable barrier and commented,
"We might with equal chance of success try to sail through the cliffs of Dover, as penetrate such a mass."
In 1956, the ice shelf was officially named the Ross Ice Shelf, as published by the U.S. Antarctic Gazetteer. The two ships sailed along the ice shelf barrier for miles, while the view of the shelf continually stretched beyond the horizon. Ross ordered soundings to determine the water depth and correctly discerned that the Great Barrier of Ice must be floating and not grounded on the bottom. Later Ross wrote,
"It is a mighty and wonderful object, far beyond anything we could have thought or conceived."
Ross also correctly surmised that the tabular icebergs that they observed must have broke off from the ice barrier. Soundings showed that some of the tabular icebergs were grounded on a newly discovered undersea bank. For days the two ships sailed throughout the region, taking soundings and making measurements. During this time they pounded their way through pack ice, and fought storms, snow, and dense fog. On February 2nd, the two ships reached their farthest point south at over 78 degrees south latitude, only 12 degrees from the South Pole. The Great Barrier of Ice stretched along the horizon as far as the eye could see. They calculated that they had seen over 250 miles of uninterrupted barrier. On February 9th, Erebus hazarded the opportunity to sail within a quarter of a mile of the ice barrier, where they measured its height at 170 feet, far above the mastheads. However, at one location, the barrier projected out from the main face and stood only 50 feet high,
affording us the only opportunity we had of seeing its upper surface from our mastheads. It appeared to be quite smooth, and conveyed to the mind the idea of an immense plain of frosted silver. Gigantic icicles depended from every projecting point, proving that it sometimes thaws, which otherwise we could not believe.
Immediately afterward, young sea ice quickly froze up around them.
We should certainly have been frozen up in a most dangerous situation, between the barrier and the pack.
By the 11th, the ships were fighting through thin but solid ice, and Ross wrote that he feared being trapped. The next day, they fell into a violent gale. With the lower temperatures of the late season, the whipped-up seas crashed over the decks.
The waves, as they broke over the ships, froze as they fell on the decks and rigging, and covered our clothes in a thick coating of ice, so that our people suffered severely.
By February 14th, the weather cleared, and they made one last attempt to sail south, still dreaming of sailing to the South Pole. The next day, they sailed within 30 miles of the recently discovered Mount Erebus, where Ross wrote they
witnessed some magnificent eruptions, the flame and smoke being projected to a great height.
The sea ice grew, hindering the ships. A thin dust-like volcanic ash fell upon the ice, coloring it like a thin paint layer. By late that afternoon of February 17th, they realized that the ice was growing too thick to make any further attempts south. They calculated that they were only 160 miles from the South Pole, several hundred miles farther than anyone before them. However, modern mapping indicates they were actually about 850 miles north of the South Pole. But Ross's focus was always on magnetism and marking the magnetic poles. Ross was likely referring to the South Magnetic Pole, and modern historical estimates of the South Magnetic Pole were likely close to Ross's estimate. Ross then named the lands that the expedition charted Victoria Land, after Queen Victoria. The name is still used today to reference that region of Antarctica. By now the sea ice was so thick that Erebus lowered its rowboats, and the crewmen cut the ice with saws, then rocked the boats, so as to break a path in the ice for the two ships. This exhausting work took up the night of the 18th, before breaking through to clearer water. By February 20th, the expedition was once again in gale-force winds, but covering large distances north as they left the sea ice. Ross recorded a frenzy of named places as they sailed, filling the charts with every observable feature, recorded with the names of many of the expedition seamen. By February 28th, after several attempts to penetrate the ice, the expedition bore off and headed north. On March 4th, after some very difficult sailing conditions and severe open ocean swells, which damaged both ships, the expedition spotted the Balleny Islands. Ross considered this sighting significant enough that he copied a portion of the logs from the seal hunting ship Eliza Scott into his own journal. John Balleny, captain of the sealer Eliza Scott, named the islands after himself. On February 12, 1839, Balleny recorded, "At 6 p.m., went on shore in the cutter's boat. Captain Freeman jumped out and got a few stones. There is no landing or beaches on this land, in fact, but for the bare rocks where the icebergs had broken, from which we would scarce have known it for land at first, but as we stood in for it we plainly perceived smoke arising from the mountain tops. It is evidently volcanic." Thus, the Balleny sealing expedition became the first human landfall south of the Antarctic Circle, and the first to recognize the islands as actively volcanic, and possibly the first volcano discovered in the Antarctic region. By March 7, 1841, the expedition sailed into the region charted as the recently discovered Wilkes Land, as mapped by Lieutenant Charles Wilkes of the U.S. Exploring Expedition. However, the wind fell calm, and the heavy ocean swells were pushing the ships towards huge icebergs, upon which the waves were
breaking violently against them. dashing huge masses of pack ice against the precipitous faces of the bergs, sometimes rendering them into a multitude of brilliant fragments against their projecting points.
For 8 hours we had been gradually drifting towards inevitable destruction.
The high swells prevented towing the ships with the rowboats, and, with no wind, the ships could not maneuver at all. Ross wrote that the crew
called upon the Lord, and he heard our voices out of his temple, and our cry came before him.
Just minutes before certain destruction, a breeze filled the sails. The heavy ships slowly lumbered away from the imminent danger. They continued to explore the region Wilkes charted, and in all of their voyage, Ross wrote that they could not confirm the discoveries claimed by Wilkes and the U.S. exploring expedition, instead describing that they had a clear sea as far as the eye could see. The expedition's next effort was to find and verify the theoretical position of the South Magnetic Pole, as proposed by Monsieur Carl Friedrich Gauss. Gauss proposed that the pole should be at latitude 66 degrees south and longitude 146 east. Ross wrote that his own magnetic measurements throughout the voyage refuted Gauss's theoretical position, but Ross was determined to reach the location stated by Gauss, to remove any question of doubt. But the expedition again faced high winds, squalls, and severe sea swells, and made little progress to the proposed location. By March 16th, the wind had died, and the swells carried them away from their destination. When the wind returned, they sailed south again, but became bogged down in thick sea ice, which struck the ship so violently it peeled away some of the hull's copper plating. However, on March 20, 1841, the expedition was able to reach within 45 miles of Gauss's proposed location. Ross's measurements suggested that the real magnetic pole was still over 600 miles away, thus disproving Gauss's theory. The expedition continued sailing throughout the region, making scientific observations until April 4th. By this time it was late in the season for exploring the southern oceans and,
having now completed all that remained to be done, we steered direct for Van Diemen's Land.
arriving 3 days later. Upon arrival, Ross wrote,
"It was a source of no ordinary gratification to me, to reflect that the execution of service had been unattended by casualty, calamity, or sickness of any kind, and that every individual of both ships had been permitted to return in perfect health and safety to this, our southern home."
The expedition crew was not idle during the winter season. Ross wrote that the ships and the supplies were in good shape, and ship repairs did not require hauling the vessels out of the water. Instead, everything on board was unloaded and put into storage. This lightened the ships and allowed them to float high enough in the water to complete repairs to the hulls. The interiors of the ships, as well as the exteriors above the waterline, were also repaired and serviced. Ross wrote that everything could be accomplished by the crew, and shipwrights and chandlers were not required. Ross, and the other officers and scientists, then spent their time pursuing the various scientific studies required of the voyage. Ross also touched on a visit to the severe penal settlement of Port Arthur, established only a few years earlier. It was here that the worst of British criminals were exported to a new psychological punishment, rather than the established physical or corporal punishment. Furthermore, Port Arthur was a site for juvenile detentions, where boys, as young as 9, were housed separate from the adults. Both groups were put to hard labor, but Ross wrote that the juveniles were taught useful trades. Modern accounts depict the prison in much harsher terms. By the end of June, the ships were repaired, refitted, and restocked, and ready for another attempt to explore the Antarctic region. On July 7, 1841, the expedition departed Van Diemen's Land and headed out to sea. The expedition's next stop was Botany Bay, in modern Sydney, New South Wales, Australia. Here they performed the standard scientific observations. Ross also noted that Lieutenant Wilkes and the U.S. exploring expedition had stopped here previously, but at the time Ross learned little dependable information of their voyage, as the U.S. government had imposed the greatest secrecy. Ross wrote too of the region's extreme fluctuations between drenching rain and severe drought. The rains caused damaging floods, and the droughts resulted in terrible crop shortages. By August 5, 1841, the expedition was once again at sea, and set course for New Zealand, arriving August 17. But upon arrival, they discovered that smallpox had broken out on a nearby American ship, and no vaccine was available. Ross appears to have been unconcerned for his crew, but expressed great concern for the native Maori population. Ross recognized, as history had already shown, that European diseases can decimate unprotected native populations. But Ross discovered that the European colonist and the Maori did not always get along peacefully. Erebus and Terror needed to repair their masts, and required wood to complete the repairs. Venturing far into the hostile native country for wood was a recognized danger. Ross, however, struck a deal with a local chief. The chief allowed Ross's crew to gather the necessary supplies, in exchange for 2 rifles and a complete lieutenant's uniform. Ross later wrote,
"And may therefore hope the rifles have not been employed against our own countrymen."
Ross added,
Another chief also visited our ships to obtain his customary present of gunpowder and firearms, and especially rum, to which he had lately become so addicted as seldom to be seen sober.
Instead of firearms and gunpowder, Ross convinced this chief to accept a selection of carpenter's tools and other non-lethal items. Ross was probably ahead of his time in recognizing that the Maori were cheated by the less than favorable treaties signed with the European settlers. But at the same time, he did not hesitate to praise the Christian missionaries who,
having endured so much hardship in their zealous endeavors to diffuse amongst the heathens the blessing of Christianity.
modern scholars now know an economic, political, and religious imperialism persisted throughout the colonial lands during the colonial periods. This imperialism rarely, if ever, benefited the native population, and often decimated them. The expedition remained in New Zealand for the next several months, conducting experiments and exploring the region. During this time they lost one man, Marine George Barker, to an accidental drowning, and were nearly involved in a small battle with the natives, until new evidence was discovered that solved the conflict. On the morning of November 23, 1841, the expedition once again set to sea. On November 25, the expedition crossed the 180th degree longitude, now the modern-day international dateline, and recorded 2 Thursdays and 2 November 25th calendar days, in order to maintain England time. Due to poor weather, the expedition bypassed the Chatham Islands, and continued east and south. On December 16th, they spotted their first icebergs, large flat-top bergs that were melting rapidly. And on December 18th, they sailed into the ice pack, continuously dodging dangerous icebergs, as they probed their way south. On January 1, 1842, the expedition not only rang in the new year, but also crossed the Antarctic Circle, having pushed and drifted through 250 miles of loose pack ice. To celebrate, the crew received their cold weather clothes and double portion of rations. But it was exhausting work to keep the ships on any kind of a course. At times, they were anchored fast to the ice until they could find a navigable opening, and at times, storms iced the rigging and bergs slammed into the hulls. They often lost ground in their efforts to sail south. While stuck in the ice, Ross wrote that the sailors hunted the various penguins and seals found on the ice. Ross admits it was a cruel act to kill the penguins until
we resorted to hydrocyanic acid, of which a tablespoonful effectually accomplished the purpose in less than a minute.
Hydrocyanic acid is better known today as cyanide. However, the seals were simply dispatched with clubs. On January 18th, while anchored to the ice, enveloped in fog, and fighting heavy seas, Erebus very nearly was lost, when a very large iceberg was suddenly seen to be closing upon them. They immediately set sail to clear the giant berg. With their sailing boom rubbing against the face of the giant berg, they cleared the far edge as the waves violently crashed against the ice, soaking their decks. While an impending death was avoided, the very next night, a violent storm struck that lasted nearly 2 days. The ships were bashed about in the ice, and both lost their rudders. Steering was useless. Erebus and Terror were only one giant wave's distance apart, but so large were the waves that the ships could not see each other as the waves passed between them. Ross describes that the crew secured themselves to the ships and waited for death as the ships shook and vibrated with each massive blow from the bergs around them. Finally, on January 21st, the storm subsided. Along with the missing rudders, both ships had sustained additional damage, but the stout ships held up well to the pounding ice. Erebus pulled and repaired her rudder, while Terror assembled a whole new rudder. Erebus could attach, or ship, her rudder on the existing hardware, but Terror was so damaged it took, as Ross wrote, significant ingenuity and alterations to effectively rig a working rudder. But even after surviving a near-disastrous storm, Ross lamented the poor progress of the expedition.
After having exhausted 5 weeks of the best part of the season of navigation, in what appeared to be, at this time, a fruitless attempt to get through this formidable pack, we found ourselves driven back to nearly the same spot we were at 3 weeks before. Our prospects were by no means cheering.
By January 28th, they had made better progress south, but still faced considerable pack ice where they had hoped to sail in open water. Ross wrote that they had navigated through nearly 800 miles of ice, but were only a few miles farther south than Captain Cook had previously sailed, but who had never entered the pack ice at all. For the next several days, the weather alternated between gale winds and no wind, both equally dangerous inside the pack ice. Both ships were repeatedly bashed against the ice, and Erebus received damage to its sail rigging, while Terror actually caught fire, forcing the crew to flood the ship with several feet of water to extinguish. But early February 2nd, both ships finally broke through to the open sea, for which they had been striving the last 56 days. Clear of the ice pack, the ships covered more ground, and on the 8th, spotted a huge iceberg that they recorded sighting the previous year, but now over 350 miles further north. On the 16th, the expedition sailed to the farthest west that they would achieve this season, only a few miles from the area they had explored and charted the previous year. On the 21st, the ships were hit with yet another storm, along with very low temperatures. The rigging and decks froze over, requiring exhausting work to break away the ice to keep the ship safe. On the Terror, Ross wrote, a fish was flash frozen in the ice encasing the front of the ship. It was carefully removed to add it to the collection,
but it was unfortunately seized upon and devoured by a cat.
The next day, 1 year later, they again spotted the Great Barrier, now known as the Ross Ice Shelf. Once again, Ross noted that depth soundings and ice measurements must mean that the barrier was floating and not grounded to the sea bottom. Ross also noted that this year's exploration had sailed slightly farther south than their efforts the previous year. Ross speculated that they spotted land to the east, but did not officially record it as such, due to the uncertainty of the observations. Modern charts suggest that he may have seen the distant lands of Roosevelt Island or the Rockefeller Mountains. But by February 24, 1842, the clear open water began to ice up, and Ross called an end to the season's exploration. Although disappointing that they had been trapped in the pack ice for such a long time, they still recognized that they had achieved a great deal, and once again proved the quality of the stout ships with which they had been entrusted. Following a more westerly route on their outbound journey from Antarctica, the expedition cleared the dense ice packs quickly and proceeded east in clear waters, only occasionally encountering icebergs. For nearly 2 weeks, the weather was reasonable and the sailing easy, but the night of March 12 promised a dramatic turn of events. With Erebus the lead boat and sailing close reefed during a snowstorm, Erebus was surprised by a large iceberg dead ahead. Ross immediately turned Erebus hard to the left, but discovered that the Terror was just behind Erebus and bearing down fast. The Terror crashed into the Erebus.
The concussion that struck us was such as to throw almost everyone off his feet. Our bowsprit, foretopmast, and other smaller spars were carried away, and the ships hanging together, entangled by their rigging, and dashing against each other with fearful violence, were falling down upon the weather face of the lofty berg under our lee, against which the waves were breaking and foaming to near the summit of its perpendicular cliffs.
The raging seas finally forced Erebus and Terror to violently rip apart from each other. Terror was able to sail clear of the giant berg, but Erebus floundered behind, unable to set any sails. Erebus was now so close to the berg that the spray from the waves crashing on the berg fell onto the deck, and the lower yardarms struck against the ice. Ross and the crew resorted to a daring maneuver known as sternboard, or sailing the ship backward. The men ran up the rigging, but it took them 45 minutes to rig enough working mast and sails to attempt to maneuver. But it worked! Erebus plowed backward in the heavy seas and backed away from the crashing berg. No sooner was that accomplished than another giant iceberg appeared, threatening to crush the Erebus between the two bergs. Erebus was finally able to turn around and sail out, but with only 3 boat widths of room to maneuver. Free of the icebergs, both ships paused on the downwind side of one of the icebergs, now protected from the storm, and commenced emergency repairs. Within a few hours, the expedition was far enough from danger to better assess the damage. Ross wrote that the crew of the Erebus immediately went to work to repair the masts and rigging, while another team cleared out the front hold of the ship to find a leak caused by the collision with the Terror. They found a fluke of the starboard anchor driven into the hull nearly a foot deep, locking the anchor in place below the water line, causing the leak. The leak was slow and quickly repaired. The anchor remained wedged in the ship for another 500 miles before breaking away during a storm. The ships continued east, braving storms and bergs. Sadly, on April 2, 1842, Quartermaster James Angley fell overboard. The lifebuoy was deployed, and Angley climbed upon it, but the seas were breaking over the sides of the ship, and it was too rough to dispatch a lifeboat. Angley held on as the Erebus itself maneuvered to pick him up, but by the time the large ship arrived beside the lifebuoy, Angley was gone. On April 5, they spotted their first land in 136 days of sailing. The next day, they were anchored at Port Louis, Falkland Islands, where they dined on fresh beef and vegetables. From April to September 8, the expedition remained in the Falklands, conducting their scientific observations and repairing and resupplying the ships. On September 8, the expedition sailed from the Falklands, bound for Cape Horn, and was immediately met with foul weather. By the 19th, they had passed Cape Horn, the southernmost tip of South America. The ships anchored at nearby Hamite Island, part of the Tierra del Fuego archipelago, met the local natives, and then set up for more scientific observations. Of the natives, Ross and Dr. Hooker wrote,
"The degraded and savage native, who wanders naked among the bleak rocks and almost equally uninviting woods of this miserable land. The Fuegians are truly described as the most abject and miserable race of human beings."
Ross wrote that the expedition enjoyed their interactions with the local people. However, as with many of the native peoples of the Americas, it would be only a short time before the European invasion of the region began, and disease and violence would decimate the native population. By the early 20th century, it is estimated that 80 to 90% of the native Fuegians population had died. On November 7, the expedition departed Hamite Island, and by the 12th were anchored again at Port Louis, Falkland Islands. Erebus and Terror delivered to the colony a supply of timber acquired on Hamite Island, as well as received mail and news from England. By early December, the expedition was ready for its third attempt at penetrating the Antarctic ice, and on the 17th set sail from the Falklands, heading due south. The expedition passed Christmas Day with a gale whistling through the rigging and icebergs all around. But as they sailed south, they experienced a melting of the ice.
We were amongst loose ice. Frequent loud reports and crashes were heard as they broke up and rolled over, so that it was dangerous to approach them, and an unusual sight to us.
They came across known land, believed charted by the French explorer d'Urville, and the crew of the Terror thought a possible volcano could be seen. But without definitive proof, it was only noted in the logs. Modern surveys now recognize a number of volcanoes in the region. New, uncharted lands soon came into view, and Ross began naming them as new discoveries. Ross wrote of one islet.
The fog cleared away, and we saw the small, high island against which we so nearly ran. I named it Darwin Islet, after Charles Darwin, Esquire, the talented companion of Captain Fitzroy during his interesting voyage.
Darwin, with data from the Ross expedition, would publish his seminal work titled On the Origin of Species, 16 years later in 1859. On January 1, 1843, the crew once again received their complete suit of warm clothing and extra provisions. Ross also named Mount Haddington, the dominant feature of the modern named James Ross Island volcanic group. 5 days later, Ross and Crozier landed on the newly named Cockburn Island and took formal possession. To their surprise, they found plants on the island, of which Dr. Hooker surveyed and published in 1847. The two ships continued to navigate through the ice as best they could, exploring the region. But by January 12th, they became locked in the ice and were bashed by bergs as the tides flowed around them. On the 14th, they attempted to pull their way through the ice by anchoring to a nearby berg and pulling the lines to move the ship. It was slow progress, and the next day Ross wrote,
The ice was mostly close-packed, and its pressure against the land was so great as to heel our ships over and make their timbers crack.
3 days later, on January 17th, they finally broke free of the ice. For the next 2 weeks, the expedition continually tried to penetrate the ice to the south, only to be carried north by the ice pack, driven by the currents and winds. By February 1st, they gave up exploring any more of this region. For the next several weeks, the expedition traveled east, paralleling the ice pack, hoping to find another way further south. But on March 3, 1843, Ross wrote,
Our former experience had led us to consider the higher southern latitudes as sealed from the intrusion of man.
On March 5th, they were able to push south, but saw nothing but more ice as they worked their way between thick patches of newly formed ice. But that night they were struck again by yet another gale storm, and struggled to keep from bashing into icebergs, while constantly breaking ice off the masts and rigging. As the storm continued, Erebus was pushed so close to an iceberg that the spray from the waves crashing against the ice fell upon the deck of the ship. For nearly 5 days they fought this storm.
It can never cease to be a source of wonder and gratitude that we escaped running against them.
As if by a miraculous sign, the weather cleared on the 10th to reveal a bright comet in the night sky. It was seen by the expedition for multiple nights, and is now known to be the Great Comet of 1843, or Comet C, 1843-D1. For the next 2 weeks they sailed east, expecting to pass Bouvet Island, which had been spotted as early as 1739, but was apparently inaccurately charted, as Ross could not find the island at its supposed location. Ross wrote extensively of previous sightings and landings, as well as their own efforts to confirm the location. The island would not be accurately charted until 1898. On April 4th, the expedition arrived at Simon's Town, South Africa, remaining a month to refit and resupply. They then arrived at St. Helena on May 13th, Ascension Island on the 25th, leaving there the 29th. On June 3, 1843, while on their way to Rio de Janeiro, the expedition paused and attempted to sound the ocean bottom. The effort ran out 27,000 feet of sounding line, but did not find bottom. This is the deepest ever recorded at the time. However, recognizing the limitations of Ross's equipment, the results do not stand up to modern soundings, which now record depths to 16,000 feet. The expedition anchored at Rio on June 18, and after completing their scientific observations, left port June 25. Throughout the voyage, the expedition made air pressure or barometric measurements, and of these Ross concluded,
"Our barometric experiments appear to prove that the atmospheric pressure is considerably less at the equator than near the tropics, and to the south of the Tropic of Capricorn, where it is greatest. A gradual diminution occurs as the latitude is increased."
Ross's limited barometric recordings could only hint at modern knowledge, but his suggestion that atmospheric pressure decreases with an increase in latitude is correct by modern observations. On the night of September 4, the expedition anchored at Folkestone, England, completing a 4-year, 5-month voyage throughout the southern hemisphere and the shores of Antarctica. Upon his return, Ross married his longtime love, Anne Coleman of Whitgift Hall, Yorkshire, on October 18, 1843, not wasting any time reuniting with his love of many years. Together they had several children: James, Anne, Thomas, and Andrew. Ross promised never to sail away again on perilous voyages. But that promise would soon be put to the test. The Ross Antarctic expedition discovered the Ross Sea and the enormous floating Ross Ice Shelf, recognizing it as the source for many of the icebergs in the southern oceans. The expedition helped to found the science of glaciology, identified the transantarctic mountains, and the volcanoes Erebus and Terror, named after the ships. The expedition advanced the science of Earth magnetism and inferred the southern magnetic pole. The expedition first described the rare species, the Ross seal, and published significant works and discoveries in the field of zoology. But it was the expedition's botanist, Dr. Joseph Dalton Hooker, who might be described as leaving the greatest mark on the world of science, with his publication of the 4-part volume, Flora Antarctica, beginning in 1844. The volume, Flora Tasmania, was the first case study for the theory of natural selection, and is considered the foundation of evolutionary biogeography, or the study of the distribution of species and ecosystems. Hooker provided Charles Darwin a copy, and it became a significant influence to Darwin's seminal work titled On the Origin of Species, published in 1859. The Flora volumes continue to be cited in modern research, and are considered a major reference even to this day. But the impacts of James Clark Ross's work and the expedition did not end with completion of the voyage. The polar seas would call Ross yet again. In 1845, Ross's closest friend, an expedition captain of the Terror, Francis Crozier, sailed again with their mutual friend, John Franklin, in yet another attempt to find the Northwest Passage. Ross was offered the expedition, but declined in order to remain with his new wife, as he had promised her. Crozier, too, was offered command of the expedition, but declined out of modesty and instead captained the Terror, while Franklin commanded the Erebus and the expedition. In Erebus and Terror, now fitted with steam engines, the new Franklin expedition left England May 19, 1845, and was last seen by Europeans that July. Both ships were considered missing in 1848, after nearly 3 years away. Several search expeditions were launched, and on January 31, 1848, although some sources state June 12, Ross, released from his promise by his wife, departed England in command of 2 ships, HMS Enterprise and HMS Investigator. Ross searched by sea and land into the summer of 1849, but to no avail. Sadly, it is believed that every member of the Franklin expedition perished. On Ross's return journey, HMS Investigator became trapped in the ice and was abandoned. The search expedition returned to England aboard the Enterprise. Many additional search efforts were made to find the Franklin expedition, even into modern times. Finally, in September of 2014, the Erebus was found submerged in 36 feet of water in Wilmot and Crampton Bay. She is known to be deteriorating rapidly. In September of 2016, the Terror was discovered below 79 feet of water in Terror Bay. She is thought to be in good condition. In 2010, HMS Investigator was found, well preserved, submerged in 36 feet of water, off Banks Island. James Clark Ross remained an officer of the Royal Navy for the rest of his life, achieving the rank of Rear Admiral of the Red in August of 1861. He settled in Blackheath, London. A blue plaque marks the home in which he lived. In 1845, the Ross family relocated to Aston Abbotts, Buckinghamshire, England. During his career, Ross received numerous awards and titles, including a knighthood in 1844, the Royal Geographical Society's Founders Medal, awarded even before his return from Antarctica, the French Société de Géographie Grande Médaille d'Or des Explorations, Doctor of Civil Law and the DCL title, Fellowship of the Royal Society and the FLS title, Fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society and the FIS title. Ross died April 3, 1862. He and his wife are buried together in the parish churchyard of St. James the Great, Aston Abbotts. Years later, famed Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen wrote of the Ross expedition.
Few people of the present day are capable of rightly appreciating this heroic deed, this brilliant proof of human courage and energy. With two ponderous craft irregular tubs, according to our ideas, these men sailed right into the heart of the pack, which all previous explorers had regarded as certain death. These men were heroes in the highest sense of the word.